everyone, and welcome to We Go Back. I'm your host, Bryan Abou Chacra, and on this week's episode, we will be reviewing Cabin Fever and There's No Place Like Home, the 11th and 12th episodes from Season 4 of Lost. We open up to Cabin Fever, where we see the birth of John Locke. We also find out that he was a premature baby that was born at 5 months. I do want to point out here that this is now the second birth of a main character we've seen in a flashback, the other one being Ben. Now let's go to the freighter, where we see Kimi and his team returning, and he tries to shoot Michael when he finds out that he's the one that sabotaged the boat. The gun won't go off, and the captain now has to fix it. What a great little callback here to Michael not being able to die and that the island won't let him. Moving along, let's bring up the vision that Locke has with Horace. I think it's really interesting that we're seeing John having a vision of somebody that he has never met but has actually died 12 years earlier. However, we are seeing him build the cabin, which is what Locke is looking for. So clearly, this shows us that the island is telling him where to go next. I did also want to comment that Horace does share the name with an Egyptian god. He's actually the son of Osiris, and we find out that his eye was injured in the fight for the throne of Egypt, and that he was healed, just like Locke also has an injured eye and has been healed by the island. Now let's go to the flashback where we see baby Locke and how he has fought off every obstacle in his way to be the youngest premature baby to survive at this hospital. And I think that this is really interesting because it's again speaking to a character trait that we now know about John Locke. He constantly just survives. No matter how big the illness or the obstacle, he will survive. Again, much like Ben. But one of the coolest parts about this episode is that there's a creepy, eerie man who we find out is Richard Alpert watching young Locke. This must have been in the 50s, and Alpert still looks the same. Pay attention to that. We now move up ahead a little bit to young child John, and we see that he's playing backgammon when his sister comes in and messes with him. One of the coolest things that I wanted to point out to you in this episode is that the die on the table, there's two sets. One has 4 and the other has 8. If you count the pieces, there are a total of 15 pieces on the board. But we do also see Locke once again meeting with Alpert. But this time, Locke is given the same test that a young child is given to determine who the next Dalai Lama is. So now let's go to the scene where Locke finds the map to the cabin in Horace's dead body's pocket. But I want you to focus more on the conversation with Ben and Hugo. They talk about how all of these bodies ended up in the ditch and how it wasn't actually Ben's decision for them to all die. It was their leaders. And he points out that he wasn't always the leader of the others. And this is something that ties directly into the next scene where we cut to Kimi and we find out about the secondary protocol on the freighter. Widmore has this in place because he knows exactly what Ben is going to do next. And it seems that he has an idea of what the protocol is for Ben. What I'm getting from all of this is a heavy suggestion that Widmore has an insight to why Ben would think that way, and that is because he probably was their former leader. I mean, we hear them talk about how in the previous episode, Ben took everything from him and he's only standing on the shoulders of all of Widmore's work. This is a tie-in and a suggestion to that. Now, while we're still on the freighter, I did want to point out that we got the Morse code message coming in to the freighter from Daniel. And it's very interesting. I want to make sure you guys noted this. Daniel sent the message at night, and they're getting it on the boat in the daytime. So again, there's this inconsistency in the time between the boat and the island. In our next flashback, we see a teenage John getting stuffed into a locker and let out by a guidance counselor. He recommends that John go to a summer camp put on by Middleos Laboratories, which is the same company that was courting Juliet that Alpert was a part of. And the common thread that ties all of these interactions together is that Alpert was trying to get John to come with him, either to a special school or to a summer camp or just seeing him when he was a baby. Alpert was there throughout his life trying to basically recruit John. On to the next flashback, we see a much older John after he's broken his back going through rehab, but he gets a visit from Abaddon. This guy visited Hurley at Santa Rosa at the beginning of the season, asking him about the other survivors of Flight 815. It was a really eerie interaction, and now we're seeing him again before Locke even made it on the plane, suggesting to him that he go on a walkabout because he will come back a different man, and that the next time he sees Locke, he'll owe him one. It's a really eerie conversation, but I want to make sure you guys didn't skim past this. When Locke finally gets to the cabin, he finds Christian Shepherd there, who says he can speak on behalf of Jacob, and he tells Locke that he needs to finally ask the one important question he's meant to ask, which is, how do I save the island? We find out that somehow has to do with the island being moved. That will be something really interesting to dive into later. That'll take us into There's No Place Like Home. This episode opens up with the Oceanic 6 triumphant return home. It's very heartwarming and really, really nice to see everybody reunited, but I do really enjoy that Hurley, seeing that Sayid has no one to welcome him, includes him into the group with his family and introduces him. I wanted to point this out mostly because of the tie-in to the last episode. We have always seen Hurley be very sympathetic and understanding to people, and I think it's great that he's always inclusive and tries to make sure everybody feels comfortable. Hey, Sayid, you made it home. You're traumatized. Here are my parents. Here's a little bit of normal back to you. And that'll take us onto the beach, where we see that Faraday has realized that the secondary protocol has gone into effect. And he seems to only know that because of his journal. And I'm bringing this up to you because this is now the second time his journal has been featured as something that gives great clues to how a big issue should be solved. So we need to focus on his journal and what his journal can do. Hell, if you actually think about it, when they went to the Tempest, he used his journal to help him solve the problem there. His journal is definitely something you need to pay attention to if you haven't been already. Now I want to get to the scene in the jungle where Jack and Kate run into Sawyer and Miles, and they tell them that Locke was right. I love this scene here because Locke was telling them the people on the boat were here to hurt them and nobody would listen. And in this exchange, we also find out that the only reason Jack is motivated to go back is because he feels responsible for sending Desmond and Sayid over to these people who are trying to kill them. Now we'll go to the Oceanic 6 press conference where we see a very tense and uncomfortable scene for the returning survivors. They are being grilled, and what I think is interesting about this, and the main theme that I think I want all of us to realize here, is that they're actually realizing that they're not returning to the lives that they used to have. They're returning to a world where everybody is going to know their face. And we know this from the scene where Sun is having her baby in Korea. The nurses immediately recognize who she is, and the same thing goes for Kate. The attorney mentions that she has one of the most recognizable faces in the world. She's got nowhere left to run. There's pretty much a tie-in to everybody who came back on the Oceanic 6. Sayid talks about how the paparazzi are vultures. We see that Hurley is not regarded any differently for being a celebrity once he's arrested. Their lives off the island are not what they thought they were returning to. But the one great thing we get from this press conference is the wonderful reconnection between Nadia and Sayid. And this episode has some great ups and downs. This is one of the ups. Now I want to talk about Sun's flash forward, where she confronts her father after she's hostily taken over his business. And I think it's really interesting what she says to her dad when she says that he is one of the two people responsible for Jin's death. And I love the little setup here. Lost is always setting things up for you. When you go back and rewatch it, which I suggest, that's partially why the name of the show is We Go Back, is because it's worth going back for several reviews. You will be able to see all of these setups, and it's really entertaining and really cool. Now I want to go to Hurley's flash forward, where we see his dad has fixed up the Camaro that he had long promised to work on with his son. And I find it really interesting that he could only get it finished and stick around after his son was gone. But when we sit down into the car with Hurley, we see on the odometer the same numbers that won him the lottery, and I think that this is really starting to lean on the supernatural part of Lost. This is a reminder that he needs to be back on the island because these numbers are important to him one way or the other. Also, a tiny little detail here, we see that the key to the Camaro is on a chain with a lucky rabbit's foot, and we also saw the co-pilot of the plane bringing back the Oceanic 6 holding a white rabbit's foot as well. Now, a couple of lighthearted scenes I just wanted to make sure that you guys paid attention to. I really loved the reaction of Sun and Jin when they see Michael on the freighter. I think that him being there was really just as flooring for everybody else as it was for the characters in the show. And when we're in the jungle and they realize that Hurley is with Ben and Locke, I love that Jack is the one who reacts like Sawyer and goes, "Son of a bitch." Now, let's get to our last flash forward, where we see Jack finally putting his father to rest. Jack finds out that Claire is actually his half-sister and that Aaron, who he's raising with Kate, is actually his nephew. And I think that this is really ironic because his father still was able to torment him from beyond the grave. And this is the first crack in the armor that we see for Jack, finding out that Aaron is actually his nephew. And when we get that reverse shot of him looking at Kate, he's actually looking right at the baby. And now we'll return to Ben, Locke, and Hurley, who have finally arrived at the Orchid Station. And we find out Ben, who always has a plan, is going to turn himself in to give Locke the opportunity to try to move the island. Whatever moving the island ends up meaning, this is going to be a really interesting end of the season. Next week's episode, we will be reviewing part 2 of There's No Place Like Home. It is going to be a really dense, awesome episode. Guys, I really appreciate all the emails that you send in. If you guys have any questions, thoughts, theories, anything like that, email me at wegobackpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at KingLordBryan. And then until next week, take care.